So this morning, I'd like to paint a clear picture for you. But before I can paint a clear picture, I need to paint a messy picture first. A messy picture of my own failure, actually. See, when I was a senior in high school, my peers kept telling me about these college courses. They referred to these college courses as blow-off classes. That in a liberal arts degree, that there would be these like entry-level college classes that were just really easy, just to coast by. You hardly had to show up to class. You were going to do really great. Now, I must also tell you that my parents and many mentors and teachers warned me about taking this approach, but a year later, as a freshman, 19-year-old, I thought I knew better. So I walked into my Intro to Art class my freshman year, first semester of college, 150 students in this room with me. I was so excited. We all loved going to class, mainly for social reasons. Actually, some of my best friends in college ended up sitting next to me in that class. One girl by the name of Val, her and her husband Miles, skied with us 10 years in a row. They came up to Colorado. Another, Emily, she married a guy and they live in Denver now. Another, Brian, who lives in Grand Junction now. And then Jonathan, a guy who we were in each other's weddings. We were just having a blast together in this class. But have you ever noticed sometimes that God gives you warnings in life, and maybe you don't realize it until you look in the rearview mirror that God was giving me a warning. Well, God was giving me a warning in this class because there was a guy sitting in class who I ended up playing intramural sports with, and he was taking the class for the third time. I failed to neglect that, and all this to say, I got a 55% on the first test. Now, they call that failing, but when you didn't study and you spent most of class socializing, getting better than a 55% is pretty good, right? I mean, I'm a glass half full kind of guy. That's past half full. But I was in a panic. I was like, I am not going to pass a class, or even if I do pass with a C, my parents are going to kill me. Luckily, I was better at math than I was at art. And so I did the calculations, and if I got an A on every other test that we had the rest of the semester, I could get a B in the class after my failures. So I became a connoisseur of the Intro to Art. Let me tell you, I was bored to death. It's not what I was into. We would have to memorize dates, like the dates something was painted, the genres, the styles, all these different things, and it was a challenge for me. Luckily, my friend Jonathan was an art major. He was really good at it, so I would go study in his room. He was so patient with me. He would get 100% on the test just because he was spending so much time teaching me how to memorize all of this information. Now, some people love this kind of art, and I've learned to respect those kind of people, even though I don't understand you. My brother's like this. He flies in tomorrow with his family to Colorado to celebrate a late Christmas. He went to study abroad. He loved to go see all the artwork in Europe. Our family affectionately calls him a pompous Euro diva now. He's so into all these things. And you know me. I'm like, I'd rather be in Colorado. Put me out in nature and all that than going and looking at the Mona Lisa. Just not that enticing to me. But I gave it my best shot, and I don't remember any of the information in class, so I just crammed for the test. Don't challenge me on it. But what I do remember is that I got an A on all the other tests. I got a B in my class, and my parents don't know this story unless they're listening on recording right now. I tell you all this because in October, I showed up for the Contemplative Ministers Initiative with other preachers who've been working on being this grounded, centered, prayerful life that we've been working on. And I see this name, one of the teachers for one of the morning sessions, Dan McGregor. I'm like, Dan, that looks familiar. And I think about it. And I go, that was my Intro to Art teacher. preacher, Dan McGregor. Now, Dan McGregor is 5'2", about 100 pounds, okay? There's no reason to be intimidated by Dan McGregor, but chills went down my spine when I realized Dan McGregor was going to be teaching one of my classes. We showed up to class, and I immediately confessed this story to him that I've just shared with you today. I sat on the front row, ready to take notes like I was going to be tested again. And we spent 3 hours talking about how Christian artists have worked to teach us biblical stories through the arts. It was a blast. We did 3 hours straight. I could have done 6 hours straight. He had enough slides to go 6 hours straight. It was such a good time. And he reminded me of something that I had forgotten. You know, for most of the history of the church, there were only a few people that could read this, that were literate, that knew how. And so the Bible has been meant to be read aloud. Even some of the epistles being read aloud to the people in the church, maybe gathered together in a house church to read the letters of Paul or others together. And so he talked about how artwork was the way to describe what was going on in these stories. See, we're used to flannel graph or televisions and PowerPoints and 4K TVs. They didn't have that. So a lot of what they had to do was paint things. And so what he was explaining to us is how these painters were opening up the biblical stories and trying to teach us or show something through art about the biblical narratives that we read about. And it just so happens the main photograph that we looked at, that we meditated on, that we considered was a photograph for our biblical text this morning. So we're continuing on in Matthew. We started in Christmas, looking at the Christmas story through Matthew's eyes, and we're taking this all the way through Easter. So let's continue on today. Pray with me as we get started. Our Father in heaven, we are so grateful once again to open up this word that you have given to us, to study it and to see what you have to say about the word that it became flesh. So give us eyes to see your reign on earth as it is in heaven. Give us ears to hear how to start a journey with you. And teach us through Jesus' example how to stand against temptation. Pour through me the gift of preaching, that the desire for Christ's kingdom will grow in our hearts. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Now there was a controversy for the first readers of Matthew, a question they asked that we still often ask today. It was, why did Jesus get baptized? I mean, why was it necessary for Jesus to get baptized? I mean, back then and still today, when we are baptized for the forgiveness of our sins. So if Jesus was sinless, what need is there for him to get baptized? It seems like a perplexing moment. And so Matthew includes this story that we are about to read for us to see the importance of why Jesus got baptized. See if you can pick it up here as we read it together, and let me give you a hint. It has to do with the Old Testament. So picking up in chapter 3, verse 13. Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? Jesus replied, let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness. Then John consented. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened up, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven saying, this is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. So Jesus tells John right off the bat why Jesus should be baptized. To fulfill all righteousness. In other words, where humanity got things wrong with God, Jesus is going to come and get things right with God. But the following verses are giving metaphors and imagery that go so much deeper, because we must understand that Jesus is the culmination and the combination of all of Israel's heroes. They're ancient heroes. He is coming to restore all of this. So first, pick up this. Jesus is getting baptized in the Jordan River. This Jordan River is the boundary line from the wilderness to the promised land. Okay? This is where Joshua, who carries the same name as Jesus, would boldly march with the Ark of the Covenant across the river, creating a way for them to enter miraculously into the promised land. God, in that story, was making a bridge for God's people into the promised land. Military imagery comes to mind. If you keep up even with any of the Ukraine wars going on right now, you will see that the rivers are very important for gaining territory. The fact that they could cross this river, which in the photographs I've seen looks pretty similar to the Arkansas River in size. It's the spring runoff. It's the high, the big wave. It'd wipe out the Scout wave for sure. And they're moving through on dry land. So there, God was providing deliverance into the promised land. Here, Jesus is making another bridge, a bigger bridge, a bridge between humanity and God coming together. And as we also continue to look at this, Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 comes to mind. As God swept over the waters, creation echoes in our ears as we think about this. Restoration comes to mind when we think of the dove. When we think of the dove coming down with a olive leaf coming down to Noah and providing that there would be dry land again. We see this incredible statement of affirmation from God to his son, which gives this echoes of this royal celebration of King David's inauguration found in Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. But most importantly, beyond any of this, the thing that Matthew wants us to see is Exodus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the people of Israel, when they pass through the Red Sea, when God splits the waters, it's described in 1 Corinthians as their baptism. So it's a moment from freedom, or from slavery to freedom. That is what is happening in baptism. Remember last week, and this theme continues on, Jesus is continuing this new Exodus. And so in order to continue this new Exodus, he has to pass through the waters of baptism with God's people. But the Exodus story doesn't stop there. Continue with me as we keep reading. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I give to you," he said, "if you will only bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and the angels came and attended to him. So it's interesting to see the start of this, that God's very Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted, or as you can see in the footnotes, tested. That's what's happening here. Because the purpose of Jesus coming to earth is to overcome sin. It's one of the big purposes, right? So Jesus has to be tempted with sin to overcome it. So in verse 2, we get one of the biggest no-duh moments from Matthew. It says he didn't eat for 40 days and 40 nights, and he was hungry. Well, no duh, I'd be hungry if I didn't eat that long either, of course, right? But there's something going on here. What Matthew's trying to convey is a biblical number. 40 days and 40 nights, the length of the storm in Noah's ark, but most importantly, the 40 years that Israel spent in the wilderness. This new Exodus story is continuing. God is making the march that God's people have taken. Jesus is following in that pattern. And so, it's at the end of that time that the devil shows up. Now, what a coincidence. Just when Jesus is the hungriest, when he has gone through all of this, that the devil shows up. Maybe you've heard of this acronym before, HALT. Hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. See, when we feel one of these things in life is when we are most likely to do something irrational, hurtful, erratic. In other words, when we feel these things, we are most likely to what the Bible would call sin. Now, we have no indication that Jesus was angry here, but he at least had 3 of the 4, right? Hungry, lonely, and tired. He's not feeling very well, and that is when the devil strikes, in that moment. Now, stay with me here, because here's where the important word for us is in reading all this. How do we stand up to temptation? Knowing that the devil will strike us oftentimes at our weakest moment. Well, for Jesus, the answer comes from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is one of the most overlooked books of the Bible, okay? I had to write a grad school paper on Deuteronomy. It is the most boring paper I have ever written. I'm convinced this paper is the cure for insomnia. Okay, just boring to read. Deuteronomy is like a combination of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus. You got laws, you got a little bit of stories in there. It's not like exciting reading when we think of books of the Bible. But for Jesus, it was important. It was important to stand up to temptation because the 3 times he stands up to temptation, he uses Deuteronomy chapter 6 and Deuteronomy chapter 8 to stand up to that temptation. So, the first temptation is about bread. But it's so much more than a debate of if you can eat gluten or if you should be gluten-free. There's so much more going on here. One of the expectations of the coming Messiah is the Messiah would reproduce the miracle of the manna. When no one had anything in the wilderness, when they were hungry, that God would come down and take care of them and provide them a great supply of food in the Messianic age. Now, we'll see this later with the feeding of 5,000. But here, there's a different lesson to be learned from it. Because do you know why God had to do that? Because Israel was grumbling and complaining and whining in the wilderness, right? He wasn't just like, they're like, we're hungry. Catch this. The Israelites said to them, this is Moses and Aaron, if we had only died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, then we sat around pots of meat and ate the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Like, oh, what a great God are you. That was their temptation in the wilderness. Jesus is now facing the same temptation. So Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 8, verse 3. He says, and if you look at this whole context of it, he only quotes part of it. It's really interesting. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Here's what's important for us to hear. Someday we're not going to have enough. We're not going to have everything we want. We won't have full bellies, metaphorically, in life. And when the hunger pains in life hit us, The question is, can we still believe God is good? When our circumstances don't say, oh yeah, things are going really well, can we say, God, I trust that you are doing something bigger, something good is happening here? Will we still hang on to God's words as true? Will we still believe God is faithful even when we can't see it, touch it, feel it, or taste it? But here's how Jesus stands up to it. Jesus doesn't need the bread. Jesus, by contrast from Israel, though he was hungry, did not need to receive a miraculous or divine provision to sustain him. He remained faithful that God would take care of him through the temptation. Jesus succeeded where Israel failed in the wilderness. Interestingly enough, in the second temptation, the devil uses the Bible to tempt Jesus. How interesting is that? Specifically, Psalm 91. It's a beautiful psalm about God taking care of his people. And in this scene, it's crazy because Jesus seems to teleport with Satan. They are beamed up to the top of the temple. It would have been at least 450 feet off the ground. So if you would have fallen, you likely would have died. And to me, this has always seemed like the most bizarre temptation. What does this have to do with anything? Jump off and the angels save me? What's going on here? But when you look deeper at it, what it really has to do with is pride and power. Those two things. See, Jesus, as God's Son, had access, both fully God and fully human, to these divine things to save him. So if he falls off the temple, the angels will come and rescue him. And so it can lead to a thinking kind of like a trust fund baby. You know, being a trust fund baby, you have a certain amount of pride that no matter what I do, Daddy's going to bail me out. He's going to take care of me, right? He's got the money and the resources that I can do all these reckless things, and it's going to be all right. Maybe you've known some of these people. They live in Boulder. And so beyond this, it leads to this messianic complex, almost like this belief that they are better than everyone else and they are using their powers for their own benefit. But Jesus compared this temptation with Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16, saying, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Jesus will find himself in a sticky situation, and at the end of this, the angels will take care of him. I would love to know what it looked like for the angels showing up, taking care of Jesus after he'd been fasting for 40 days. I imagine them like nurses and doctors at the ER. They're taking his blood pressure medication or putting the cuff on. They're giving him an IV, hydrating him. They're giving him a little bit of food. That's how I like to imagine it, but just such a crazy scene. And in the midst of all this, Jesus will use God's power throughout Matthew's gospel. But Jesus only uses God's power when it's in line with God's will, with God's purposes, with God's desires for how to do things in the world. Jesus doesn't just use his power to benefit himself and his own ego. So likewise, we don't go around trying to put God to the test. Now, God's saving work still works. I think God is still working to save us in two ways. First, often God saves us out of his grace and mercy, where we don't need to jump off a building intentionally. We just do enough dumb stuff by our own human sinfulness that we get stuck and we say, God, save me. And often in grace and mercy, God does this. Second, I think when we faithfully follow God close enough, God is going to lead us to places where God is the only one that can get us out of those places. It reminds me of the book of Acts. Acts, they're in some pretty sticky situations. And God over and over again rescues them in the book of Acts. The lesson of the second temptation is that our faith isn't about ego and pride. We always come to God in humility, submitting to the will of God. And so we look at the final temptation. The final temptation is all about the purpose of power. Suddenly we see another teleport from the temple to the top of a mountain. And Satan is offering Jesus the power to be the dictator of all of the world if only Jesus will worship Satan. And it's a temptation that so many fall for, right? I mean, not just dictators around the world, but bosses. I bet you've worked for someone before who's like, when I get that promotion, I'm going to be different. I'm going to care for the people. I'm going to look out for them. And then they get that promotion and they're worse than the previous boss was because they're just using everything for their own power, for their own ability. Everyone is to be serving them instead of them doing the opposite. And this vantage point is a vantage point that Jesus completely refuses to accept. He fights it off by quoting one of the most memorable phrases in all of the Bible, in Jewish tradition, probably the first things he memorized as a little child. He quotes the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." That's where it comes from, quoting this. In other words, Jesus chooses to love God more than all the other kingdoms of this world. God's kingdom over any kingdom any human might have. Jesus could have led a life as a king where everyone had to serve him. That is not the decision Jesus makes here. Jesus decides to live a life where he is serving everyone else. It's a different kind of kingdom, often referred to as an upside down kingdom, where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And this line of thinking has gotten Christians in trouble for thousands of years. Thousands of years living this way. It's brought them in conflict with other kingdoms of the world, with other powers that thought they were more powerful. And from this moment on, Jesus sets down any notion of an earthly crown. And he trades his crown in for a crown of thorns. See, for many of us, the idols of an earthly kingdom can captivate us, can grow in our hearts to think, if I just had this power, this success, I could do these things with it. But we must remember how Jesus works, and Jesus works in his kingdom, because Jesus reminds us that there is a better kingdom to serve. So what do we take away from the text this week? Well, I think there's a couple things. One question I hear often in talking with someone considering coming to faith is, why should I get baptized? Why should I get baptized? Well, we could tell them some of the standard lines, but I think there's a short answer that's really important. Because Jesus got baptized. Okay, why should you get baptized? Jesus got baptized. But there's a longer answer to this. In our baptism, we are connecting our story to that of the new Exodus. Because our stories, however good they are, ultimately end as a tragedy. But in our baptism, we are connecting our story to the best story ever told. By our baptism, we are participating in God's freedom. We are going from slavery to freedom with humanity, with God's people, with all of creation. What a wonderful reason to get baptized if you're considering it. However, we must not forget that we are not exempt after our baptism. See, after our baptism often comes some of the difficult times of testing. Jesus wasn't exempt from temptation, neither are we exempt from temptation. We have to decide in our life, when we make the commitment in baptism to join God in this new Exodus, are we okay spending some time in the wilderness? And when we're in the wilderness, how are we going to handle it? It's really hard not to grumble and complain when you're hangry, right? God, are you going to look out for me? God, are you going to take care of me? But Jesus teaches us in the wilderness how to respond in faith, trusting that God is still looking after us. So now that we've gone through the teaching of this week, I want to give you the image of this week. This picture was painted by a Russian artist named Ivan Kramskoy in 1872. Ivan's style of painting was described as realism. In other words, he sought to paint Jesus by invoking these ideas of his heroic self-sacrifice. This is Ivan's most famous painting. It's referred to by two different terms, Christ in the wilderness or Christ in the desert. It's a beautiful depiction of what we have read today. I want to offer you some observations of what I see in this painting. And what I think would be really cool is if after service, if we talked with each other about different observations we had or you all had in looking at this painting. So first of all, this painting looks cold to me. Back it up one slide. We'll get to that one in just a second. It just looks cold. You can see either the sun setting or rising in the background. But Jesus, having spent the night out there, doesn't seem to have a lot of warm clothes. He seems to be on the rocks, which seem really cold. Maybe he was shivering. He's gazing down to me, looking at the rocks in contemplation. In contemplation to me of like, should I turn these things to bread? I mean, I'm kind of hungry. Should I make some bread out of them or should I leave them, as he prayed about it? At first glance, it's a reminder to me of how uncomfortable Jesus was during his time of temptation. Now let's zoom in on his face, Emmett. It looks dirty to me. Doesn't seem like he's well groomed. It seems like he's been spending 40 days in the wilderness. But more than that, his face looks sunken to me, somber, as he's hungry and fighting the temptation. Next, let's look at his hands. His hands to me are grasped together. He's got his elbows in like he's trying to hold on to every single piece of warmth he has while maybe praying. Praying that God would take care of him, would comfort him through this time of temptation. And then finally, look at his feet with me. His feet look dirty and they look cold as he's barefoot walking around on the sharp rocks. And while this picture might feel on the surface a little somber, overall this picture looks to me what it looks like to overcome. To overcome the temptation of our physical needs, of our pride and ego, and the temptation or the need for power and control and recognition. So in hope today, I hope you have a clearer picture of not just what Jesus did for us, joining in this new Exodus story, but how you can participate in this new Exodus story, how you can stand up to temptation. So let's pray as we close. God, we come to you once again, another week studying your word, coming to say thank you. Thank you so much for what Jesus did to pass through the waters with us, to overcome where we failed, to give us this life of freedom to live into. So be with us, Lord, through the power of your Spirit, that when we go through temptations, may we respond in the ways that Jesus responded to overcome whatever obstacles we may be facing. Most of all, God, lead us to your freedom. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.